Well, thank you all for joining. I'm really excited that we can go through what is one of my favorite topics, which is how do you overcome the common pitfalls in terms of brand positioning? What have we all seen, but perhaps don't discuss in terms of moving brands forward and really bringing them more into, the current markets and current times? I think this is going to take about 30 minutes in terms of the overall webinar. And please, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat section at the end of the entire presentation. We'll go through all of your comments or thoughts so we can have a discussion afterwards. Uh, in terms of, top brands, I've seen that there are a couple of reasons why we don't see all the results that we would want in terms of uh, brands positioning and what we would want from that. And the big thing is, generally, we've seen that there's an unclear idea of what the business goal is, and this really affects a successful brand positioning. The other part that we've also seen is that there's a lack of comprehensive insights. We think that we have everything that we need, but then we find during the process, whether it's insights about industry or about our customers, we don't have this. And it's so important in terms of building those strategies and building that confidence. The other part is, as teams, we don't quite engage all of the stakeholders that we need to early on in terms of doing a brand positioning. It goes across all teams in terms of how do we show our business externally. And this is really a missed opportunity, whether it's for a sense of ownership or also, of course, buy-in so that you have that success later on, especially when it comes to implementation. And the other part that we've seen is, especially with brand positioning, is that there's this lack of perceivable results. And this is something that we need in terms of establishing credibility as a team and also making sure that we can show our efforts to others so they really believe in what we're doing. And the last one is what I've seen, and perhaps some of you have as well, is that teams try to manage this internally without some sort of an external view or external support. And many times we kind of hope the situation will improve on its own, even though it can still be quite difficult to do purely from an internal perspective. Now, this is really not about me, but I'll go through a couple things and then we're just going to jump into all of the great content. But for some, a bit of a level set of why I love talking about this is I founded a consultancy in terms of branding. It's called Vernonical, and I really love helping top global brands across all industries. You really get a lot of shared learnings as well as learnings that you can apply to others, whether it's FMCG or CPG, B2B, hospitality, beauty, and health. And after working for 15 years in the industry, you really see how things evolve, whether it's the market or our perception of how we manage and grow brands. And I guess I'm a bit of a practical person. I love building and expanding businesses and using creativity to do that. And I believe that brand positionings are dynamic. They're not these things, you don't put your brand on a pedestal and then wait, but they really are strategies that can unlock an overall vision, really align your team, and honestly uncover the brilliance that every brand has, but sometimes can be hard for us to see. And what I like to talk about is kind of reality, like what is actually happening within the organization, what is actually happening within teams versus brand theory, which sometimes can look really nice, neat, and easy when uh, when doing brand strategy and building really isn't that easy in practice. So the big question really is, why should we reposition or position our brand now? Why is this important? And I found that if we don't have strategies that meet our customer needs, it really can, decrease engagement and loyalty, and also just a lack of belief in a company and its direction. And when you have a core proposition for your brand or, for your products and services, and it's a little bit muddled, customers don't quite know what to expect from you. And when it comes to more of a creative perspective, it really can dilute your brand identity without that sort of focus or clarity. And I will probably talk a lot about resources because it's, the backbone of getting work done. But when you don't have that focus, it really has an effect on the efficiency of resource allocation. And that can really lead to some missed opportunities as well as being able to expand the business, especially if you're using resources repetitively because your core proposition is a little bit muddled. And I have to say, brands are managed by teams. And if teams start to see whether it's slower growth or a declining market performance, it can be a little demotivating and a little exhausting because we all want to see the results of our work. We all want to contribute to, the businesses and the teams that we're a part of. And a lot of times it also just causes a little bit of confusion and doubt in terms of the direction. And this kind of misalignment, especially when it comes to global and regional teams, can stifle innovation and can really be an issue when it comes to going towards strategic goals. So, but why? Like, why are we seeing this? It's because the reason brands are growing has changed. I think a couple of years ago, we could say experience. We're going to do experience for a brand, and that could differentiate from other people. But now it's not quite the case. Having a well-rounded set of platforms, services, and products, as well as ways to communicate, is expected. And what we've started to see is, especially when core propositions are changing within brands, you get a lot of what I would call brand clutter. I think a lot of people talk about inconsistency, but what I see more is clutter. So a lot of repeat work, a lot of just stuff in the market across channels and regions. And this starts to overwhelm or sometimes underwhelm audiences because it's hard to understand what's actually going on or what your proposition is. Now, this is why brands now need to go beyond just this idea of experience and really showcase what is their genuine value and focus. I think we all have probably opened our phones or computers and been bombarded with information. That's the same thing with customers, whether we're talking about B2B customers or B2C customers, and we are all a little bit of both. Now, I've also seen that teams are not equating, say, executional work that is not quite there to positioning. And we're going to talk about that because when it comes to positioning, it is the base of what we're doing. And the other part I've seen is that, if stakeholders aren't engaged early on, they won't champion it later. And that will be an issue in terms of how brands are changing in terms of how they're growing. And honestly, we've probably seen this as well as when the positioning isn't quite there, we try to adjust or fix it within an individual project, whether we're talking about a retail project or a comms project, but we simply can't do that anymore because you won't have that impact that you need across multiple channels. Now, let's reframe this. Let's start to see what was and what we could be in terms of doing brand positioning. Now, there are three things I want to look at. And again, just a reminder, if you have any questions that come up, that question you think, should I ask it? Yes, just ask it, put it in the chat, and we'll address it at the end of the presentation. Here are the three things. One of them is insights. How do we know what we're doing is aligned with what we know or what we think we know? The other is alignment amongst teams, especially as brand positioning affects multiple people and projects. And then implementation, which is not only a larger rectangle because implementation is pretty long as a word, but also it's really when your brand positioning comes to life. Now, in terms of insights, I really realized something clear. It's not about the amount of insights. Now, this buffet looks pretty good, but when it comes to insights, we don't want a buffet of insights in order to do a brand positioning. We want to make sure that we can create an informed positioning with informed curated insights because we want to make sure it resonates with your target audience. So making the right curation of insights is super important so we don't overwhelm our teams and that we really get to the focus point of what issues we're trying to solve. Now, I think I've seen with insights is that when strategies don't meet customer needs and we don't understand what those are, that it can really lead to decreased engagement and business growth. And that's where, if we have this buffet of insights, we feel like, wow, we have everything, when we might not have the specific things that we need to know in terms of how is the industry changing, how are customer needs changing, and what is their perception overall of our business as well as the industry that we're in. And I think insights help build confidence. And maybe you've seen this within teams that when you have those right insights, that you really start to build confidence in decision making. It's not just about making some perfect strategy, but we are actually, as teams, making decisions on what we perceive as the best way forward for our brands. And, you know, I think buffets can also be a little bit overwhelming, as many people can be overwhelmed as well. And I would say, if you've ever considered leveraging what insights are available, and in the process, keep building those insights and further filling those gaps. Now, we're going to look at another fun image when it comes to some of the issues I've seen, which is alignment. Now, alignment can feel like an obstacle course. It can feel like a game that you have to play over and over. But what I've seen is that many times people are trying to do brand positionings without getting strong buy-in. One team sees that vision, but they really have to bring that vision to others. And I can tell you sometimes it really does feel like an obstacle course. And what I've seen is strong stakeholder buy-in and agreement on the foundations is key to long-term success, especially with a brand positioning, because your brand is the outward demonstration of your business and how you communicate what you're doing. So if people don't agree on what are the issues or what are those foundations, it's gonna go throughout the entire project and be an issue, especially with implementation. And when you have this, it really ensures alignment around the brand's vision and direction. And I don't know if you've ever seen this, but you know, if you don't have that buy-in, it really can lead to resistance later and re-questioning why we're doing something. And it also then leads to one of my favorite topics, which is an inefficient use of resources and a duplicate use of resources. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen this, but once you involve stakeholders early on and you really address their perspective, whether you agree with their perspective or not, it really helps to keep the project going. And I have to say, those conversations are some of the most valuable because you start to see how people are perceiving their business and how people are perceiving their brand, because that's going to affect your positioning overall. Now, another fun photo, which is implementation and dominoes. And I have to say, you know, this is where I see brand positioning losing its effort, its momentum, and its efforts is especially within execution. You can have a domino effect in the right way or the wrong way when it comes to executing against a brand positioning. Now, I think sometimes when our creative work isn't there, we can, whether it's in creative, comms, service, product, or innovation, we think it's everything but positioning. To be honest, a lot of times it does go back to that. And when we don't have the right use of budget or the right use of resources, it's going to be depleted for projects later on. So when we get to the end of the year, like we are now, we might not have the right budget that we would need to keep growing the business and to keep setting ourselves up for the next year. And I have to say, have you ever analyzed or even discussed the root causes of those kind of not quite there executions? It can be so interesting to see really what is the issue from both sides, the people who are working on it, people who are doing the strategy and the alignment. And then, you know, this was a great phrase I had from another strategist. And she said that kind of jumping over positioning. I'm wondering if you've ever seen that within projects when we kind of just jump over doing the right brand positioning. And what happens? To be honest, what I've seen is generally it will come back at some point where we think in the beginning of a project we can just jump over doing positioning when we can't. And down the line, we see that it has created not the right domino effect, but a domino effect in terms of the effectiveness of our work and that spark that we want in terms of, you know, whether it's, you know, products, innovation, or creative. Now, I think for all of us, buffets that have obstacle courses and dominoes sound kind of fun if we're going on a cruise line, but if we are actually trying to do a project with teams and with people, we probably want a little bit more, more of a simple process. And that's what we're going to try to reimagine in terms of a process for doing brand positioning. Now, we're going to look at three more things. It's really important that we examine the brands and the context, that we really engage our teams and stakeholders within the process, and we start to envision an entirely new context for our brands. And we're going to go through all of these three things in terms of how do we do brand positioning a little bit better so that we don't feel like a buffet obstacle course domino effect as we're trying to go through these processes. What I've seen in terms of examine is that if we can really start to see and realize our brand potential, it can drive business opportunities, product innovation, and really kind of team belief in direction. We don't talk a lot about team belief in direction, but it can be so important in terms of bringing that spark and that clarity to any type of work. And that's really what this graphic on the right is saying. Brand positioning can help amplify opportunities and innovation and inspiration. And what I've seen is that I think when we're, internal, and I've been a bit of both, is that we lack this kind of perspective of how amazing our brand really is. We sometimes just get a little bit used to it, like the furniture that we have in our house. And as we're doing a brand positioning project, it's a great time to kind of clean out our perspective and have a bit of a reset to uncover really what are those brand strengths and opportunities. And I believe those are things that we can look at from both internal and external insights. Internal insights, you're going to get a lot of those stories of what we're being perceived of and why, whether it's from customer service or from sales. And those external insights will start to continually paint that picture of how we are being perceived externally and what that means from a business or revenue perspective. And I'm just wondering if you've ever seen when a brand positioning feels authentic. And we've heard that word a lot of times, but when I say authentic, it's when it really feels appropriate and relevant to the company as well as to the context and differentiated. It really can help with opportunities, whether it's maximizing or even focusing in on opportunities. And I think that when a team really believes in the strategic direction, they don't just sit there and kind of say, sure, we're going to execute on it. It really can fuel, whether it's growth or really inspire innovation and discussions. And I know it's like there's so much going on when it comes to brand positioning, but I really believe it is kind of a focal point that helps us move forward. And that's where Engage really is that we can ensure that in a better process that everyone is engaged in what is the impact on the business. And I have to say, much like this brand flower, which is completely ridiculous concept, by the way, but it was one of the best ways to illustrate this, was brand positioning touches on so many aspects of your business, whether it's sales at the top and how they can communicate to their customers, or even down to product in terms of what are those focuses in terms of features. Because we might have a huge brainstorm, idea of what we should do next when it comes to features, but does it go toward our core proposition and have that effect across the business? Now we need to really look at and help teams overcome challenges during the process, because a brand repositioning project isn't just getting to some PowerPoint that looks good and sounds good, but it's really about changing our perspective as teams about our brand and how we even perceive the business that we're working within. And I think we all want to make sure what we're doing is tangible and observable. We not only to show that we're going in the right direction, but to show to the business and for them to believe in what we're doing. And that's really important throughout the entire process is looking at how you can show that as you're doing a brand positioning. And I think, whether it's a brand positioning project, a strategy project, or a creative, I just wonder if you've ever seen how if stakeholders really understand every step of the process, how it's a little bit easier. Where in some part of the processes, you're going to have to wait to see how that creative idea comes to life. And other part of the processes, it's really important to have a strong decision made. And when it comes to brand positioning, much like this, I know it's a little ridiculous illustration of a flower, but it really can affect multiple projects, whether it's a creative comms project or even an innovation project, is that sometimes we forget to highlight that brand positioning is really the focal point for the start of how we perceive the growth within our business. And I think I would, love to emphasize that these processes can be fun, if I might say, and even engaging. And one of the goals, especially with a brand positioning project, is to look at how do you start to use creativity in a way to unlock ideas, to be honest, that are actually already in front of us that we might not be seeing as something that we could use for our brands. And that's really what this uh, envision steps are trying to show, is how we start to challenge what we know and where we want to be. And that's where really providing those right tailored tools encourages engagement and collaboration throughout the entire project. And I mean like the right collaboration, not just, we have to collaborate because we have to, or we have to engage because we have to, but at the right times with the right people. And that's going to change throughout the process of how much you involve a team or a stakeholder versus down the line when you're doing a brand positioning or a repositioning project. Now, what we kind of forget is, especially when we've been in industries for a long time, is that there are a lot of assumptions that live within each industry, and sometimes they're useful and sometimes they're outdated. So if we can start to challenge and question assumptions, this helps us to move forward and create something that's more relevant for a future versus an assumption that kind of comes from our past knowledge. Now, one of my favorite topics and something I'll talk about more, but it really does cause underlying issues with foundations when we don't challenge our assumptions and really test what the status quo is and ask ourselves, why is it like that? And I don't know if you've ever seen a project with positioning that actually felt a little bit enjoyable or engaging or inspiring. It really can be a nice time to kind of connect as a team and kind of clean up and uncover what is really there in terms of your brand. It really is a little bit like a spring cleaning in terms of how we start to address our brands externally and how we start to work internally on our brands. And I have to say, we sometimes think brand positioning is only about that final presentation, but I'm wondering if you've ever seen a project where people's perspectives start to change. And when I've worked as a strategist, I actually find this sometimes the most uh, encouraging aspect of the project when we, much like these stairs on the right-hand side, you start to see teams changing their perspective. They're challenging assumptions. They're maybe asking themselves, why is this the status quo? And they're trying to have this view from the outside of their brand and to really kind of dust it off certain parts and really see where those aspects of the brand are shining. And that's where you can get some unexpected inspiration around what your brand could be and changing the perspectives within your team of that potential. And the reason why we have all of these three steps is because your customers, whether we're talking B2B customers, B2C, or somewhere in between, is that they do want to connect to your story in somehow. Now, I know with B2B, we say that customers are not emotional, and that's really just not true. And when you see it with where a brand story overlaps with a customer story, this idea of an emotional connection can come from many things, whether it's an aspiration, a challenge, or a community. That's where you can get different aspects of overlap in terms of your brand story and your customer story. In the end, your customer wants to know that you know who they are because they have so many different choices. And that's the thing, is that we want to make sure that we focus on the strategies that really improve that connection with your audience, not the connection with someone else's audience or someone else's industry, but your audience. And that's why in the beginning I was discussing, buffets. We don't want buffets. We want focal points in terms of what that emotional connection is and what that story is. And when you have a compelling brand story, and you know what those focal points are, it really can resonate with the right emotions with your customers. And that really creates that, both that connection, and we say this a lot, but really it's also mind space because in so many industries, whether we're talking about FMCG or even SaaS, commoditization is an issue. And if you have some sort of connection, you can get a bit more consideration and mind space in terms of your product, company, or service. And that's, to be honest, one of the most difficult things today, especially as we open our computers and I have no idea how much information within 1 minute. And I'm just wondering if you've ever seen when you really actually amplify those actual inherent strengths and unique value propositions, how great that can be. You really start to see something that feels relevant and authentic, to be honest, for the company, and that your customers really start to understand it. And again, I'm just wondering if you've also seen this where it's not only about a brand position, but a brand position that still feels dynamic and can still adjust and adapt. This is not only because we will generally have a brand positioning across, multiple parts, the entire business, whether it's global or regional, but the market changes. So we don't want to do a brand positioning project today and have to redo it in a year. That's not it. We want to create a positioning that is still dynamic and has a degree of flexibility and give so it can last. So let's look at a process. And again, any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll, go off of this whole presentation mode and we'll have a discussion about this. So what is the process for doing this? It sounds good. We don't want buffets, at least when it comes to these sort of projects. But how do we look at doing this? And there are kind of three phases that I've seen when it comes to a brand positioning project, especially when you start to think, how will this be implemented? And making sure that perspective is in the beginning so you don't get to the handoff and be like, oh, well, how do we actually deal with this new positioning that no one quite understands? Now, the big thing for me is starting with a reframe. As I said, it really is about team perspective. So how do you start to reframe how we think about our industry, our assumptions, the status quo? And this is through igniting conversation and really getting that pulse of what's going on now, what we think will be going on later, and what is going through our customers' minds, as well as just the pulse of the entire business, because this does reflect your business. The other part is we kind of know what's going on. Let's really reimagine how we can do this, reimagine it quickly through different sprints, and reimagine it in terms of where we want to position ourselves. Because much like the title of this webinar, it's really about powering up your position. It's not, you want to kind of get above some of the noise in your industry so that people have the mind space to consider you for a product or service, especially within more commoditized industries or ones that become a bit commoditized. And then we want to rev up. We want that handover from figuring out our position to what that means for our business across all those teams in the brand positioning flower, is that we want to outpace ourselves in the market, and we really want to boost what we're doing in terms of the positioning and start to think of how does this affect our innovation work, creative work, how we talk as a sales team, and how we look at our business. And all throughout, this is a process that we want to make enjoyable, inspirational, and help us to update our perspective, kind of clean off our brand, get rid of some of the clutter. And that's why I believe the 3 Rs, reframe, reimagine, and rev up can really help us to position our brand where we not only need it to be, but something that we feel actually genuinely works to our company, our teams, and our business. Now, a couple pieces of advice in this kind of triangle of status quo and best practices is it really is important for us, and I know it sounds easier said than done, is that we do want to kind of challenge the status quo by understanding really what's going on now. We kind of need to ask these questions over and over. Ones that we asked a year ago about status quo, we kind of need to ask again. And this is because in this status quo triangle is that status quo kind of sometimes becomes best practices. And that's a little bit of an issue sometimes because we use best practices as shortcuts. However, when we start to challenge best practices through innovation, that's where we can get some really interesting and relevant projects, because best practices can either be those or a bit outdated. But then innovation turns from the status quo. What we need to understand is where are we on the status quo triangle, and what does that mean for our project as well as our business and brand? I also think that when you really align brand positioning with some sort of emotional connection, and much like in that Venn diagram, the right emotional connection and story, it really helps to foster that loyalty and mind space. And when it comes to implementation, which to me is actually one of the most important parts of a brand positioning, is when you have that right strategy, you have to make sure that it's something that still feels agile. And what I mean by that is you have a bit of speed and flexibility in terms of how that brand positioning can come to life and that you can still bring in that degree of innovation. We don't want to create a positioning that feels stifling. We want to make sure we create something that people feel like they can actually work with. And that's why, at least for me, when brand positioning has very non everyday words, I think it's also hard for teams to really grasp and take as their own, because we want people to believe in that brand positioning as a team. And I think that's why even throughout the whole process, especially with this idea of challenging status quo and challenging best practices, is that we want to make sure that we encourage people to seek clarity. If they don't understand why we're saying, our team is or our business is the fastest, and we don't really understand what fast means, we want to make sure that we get clarity on that, whether it's internal or external teams, because that clarity is going to lead to better work, whether we're talking about creative work or innovation work or product work. Now, I've you know proof is in the pudding, which I guess kind of works uh, for today, is I've been able to work and been really glad, I guess, to work with a lot of different teams, whether it's enabling, Reckitt B2B to have a more, kind of confident, authentic direction. And we've seen that enable multiple teams. And much like going back the beginning of the presentation, that really took time, to be honest, to find that positioning that we really felt was something that we could own. And also I've, helped out to successfully relaunch Regent Hotels, especially from a guest experience perspective. And that really helped to expand its global footprint, especially as, at least in that category of hospitality, luxury was changing, and it still is changing today. And whenever I've looked at, elevating brands and customer experiences, my priority has always been making sure that in terms of shaping any sort of creative direction, that we are super sharp on positioning. Because if we're not, I know as someone who's been both a strategist and a designer, it just will not have the right setup for someone in a more creative facility to take it and run with it. We want to make sure that positionings are really a jump off point so people can start to really believe in it, and also keep interpreting it, keep developing what that creative or business interpretation is of that positioning. And I've also helped to relaunch, I guess a couple of different brands, but within beauty, Clinique retail in China. And that was really for us, really understanding how do we want to position it regionally, because the idea of beauty in China is different than other parts of the world. And this idea of West is best is and has been out for quite a while. Now, positioning power up. This is what I really believe in the process. And I think it really starts to include three, four things that most people are missing in terms of the process. The big one for me is those inherent strengths, the ones that really feel relevant and doable in terms of a business, really dusting everything off and really having those discussions of what are those existing strengths, not trying to find new things. But I believe with every brand positioning, it is already, but it's kind of having those discussions to align on it. The other part about it is really, what I believe in this process and what a power position power up would do is really accelerate that action plan. We want to make sure that people start to see results, start to see what this actually means. It's not just some phrase that we're going to put on our website, but really can drive business and different opportunities. Now, the other part is making sure that it fosters the right collaboration to identify kind of those top strategies for differentiating brands. And brand differentiation is a whole nother topic, but there's so many different ways you can differentiate. And that really comes down to your industry and your business and making that focus of how do we want to differentiate? What is that status quo and assumptions people haven't questioned for a while? And where does our brand fit within that? And what can we talk about? What can we, what are the conversations people are having but not actually having on a public scale? And the other part is really that ongoing support. I really believe that, you know, when it comes to refinement and execution, that's the hardest part, and that's really where you're going to see brand positioning work or not work in terms of whether it's creative work, innovation work, comms, or product development. Now, there is an offer around this positioning power up to kind of go through what is it like, what does it mean if you want to actually do a positioning power up, and it really starts with an ignite session, and this is to identify key growth opportunities for your brand and your business. And the other part is, let's take a bit of a brand pulse check to see what insights we have, what insights we need, and how to uncover those key strengths that can take you into the future. The other part is making sure that we really do a differentiation strategy sprint and start to develop and identify those top opportunities for your brand. Where is the right place to differentiate, and what are those specific ways to do so? And then it's really make it even earlier in the process to create that implementation plan so that you get that boost and you have that tactical 90-day launch plan when it comes to your brand positioning. So you're not doing a positioning, being like, awesome, and then you have to restart all those projects later. That already starts to come into the project earlier on. And as I said, I really believe in this kind of continual ongoing guidance to have implementation be done successfully, because that's where people are going to see the results and the credibility. And I really truly believe that the right positioning statement, one that feels powerful, one that feels like human language, really can help when it comes to brand credibility and focus, again, with your teams, because it's teams that will execute against this positioning. And that's why I keep emphasizing the team aspect of this versus, again, the kind of neat, easy brand theory that we see on templates. And one of the things I'm really excited about is more of a customer insights toolkit, which helps us not only to enhance how we understand our customer needs, but to start to work with the insights that you do have so it doesn't feel like a buffet, and you can start to understand whether it's adjacencies or other aspects of insights that you can use and gather and then create that entire story in terms of a positioning. Now, this is an offer in terms of a positioning power up. Of course, it's about bringing value information, but really saying, hey, if this is something of interest, all of this is really just for €9,000 a month in terms of that support and guidance in terms of doing a positioning power up to make your brand really sing and really shine in terms of what's actually there. Because whether you're B2B or B2C, I believe that every company, you might not think your brand is exciting, but to other people, it really can be. And that's the goal, is to really bring out that brilliance. And I've talked a lot. So I have to say thank you for joining in terms of this webinar. I really appreciate you all, showing up and listening as we've been going through it. And I just want to, throw it over to you all and see if you have any questions in terms of the presentation.
Not really a question, but I'm happy to jump in, Emily, and just say thank you. That was really insightful. I think, I mean, I had little notes at the very beginning, just the title was such a nice provocation of the session of just like the common pitfalls. And so I was just like off the top of my head going, what are the common pitfalls that I feel we come up against a lot? And a lot of it really, resonated with then the kind of action plans that you put in place. I think the main takeout that I will leave with is about making as quickly as possible something actionable, because I think that's the most common pitfall from my perspective that you can see, especially with big organizations and lots of people and big machines. You can stay too long in the theoretical land, and then everyone almost gets lost because it's just opinion a bit, and you're kind of like, but what does this really mean? And I think giving some thought to what that might be, that action plan is really valuable, and it will be different things for different brands or organizations. But whether it's a pilot that you can try or some validation data points that you can get early on to say, yes, we are on the right path, it's actionable, it's tangible, let's keep going. Or as you said, envision, I think, in one point, and I liked that a lot as well. Sketch something and it doesn't have to be perfect, but once people see something, they go, oh, I get it,
Yeah.
I fall in love with it. Like, how can you make that tangible early? Because otherwise, I think you really get stuck a bit in verbal spin land
I like that.
and
It's so true.
opinions. So yeah, that for me was a big kind of big star against that note, and a good point. Like, how can we make it actionable early? So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a great. I do like verbal spin. I'll probably have to use that. Actually, the jumping over in positioning came from a conversation with Katie, another strategist, and I was like, that's exactly what I've seen. And the verbal spin, indeed, people get a bit lost, like in words, and everyone's trying to make it completely perfect without seeing if that perfection helps, like as you're executing and going down the line, and it gets to be a little painful. So yes, I think if you can somehow make it tangible, whether it's, as you said, sketching it. And the other thing we actually overlook is sometimes even polling our own internal teams or like employees. If there's any way to get some kind of feedback quickly, I think it helps for people to focus, because I've even seen that in design projects. We keep tweaking and twiddling versus really getting that solid feedback of some sort and then kind of going forward with it. So I'm glad you've observed, oh, not glad, but it's good to hear your experience as well, especially because we've also worked together in terms of theory land and how a little painful it can be um, to get out of theory land. I think once you get in it, then it becomes a little bit of a black hole. So yes, that's something in terms of positioning I think is important to acknowledge and just kind of get out of. We have another question. Jana, let's see. How do you balance a brand's existing consumer perception with the need to differentiate, especially when considering global versus local positioning? That's great. Um, why don't we address the existing consumer perception and the need to differentiate? I think with perception, it really helps that, perception can be both positive and negative. Someone can look at your brand and be like, wow, it's amazing, or they can look at your brand and say it's not quite living up to my needs. So when we start to understand like existing perception, it's both to see, are we are consumers seeing us the way that we want to be seen, or is there kind of an issue in there that we want to solve? And I think when it comes to consumer perception, it's really important with positioning, because as a business, like consumer perception will affect everything, whether it's like sales, responding to comms, product features, if they don't really believe in what you're doing, or don't trust you, if that's one of the key aspects of perception, then it's going to affect your entire business. So I think it's needing to know what that perception is. Does it align with what you want it to be or where you want it to be? Is there a gap or an issue within that? And then it's funny, it's not necessarily, differentiating perception are related, but depending on your industry, we have to understand what's the right point of differentiation. And if that's what you want to be known for, there's some perceptions that will be like just generally needed. Like, for example, a lot of B2B is about trust and credibility. But then when it comes to overlapping, um, how you stand out or differentiate is like, why do you want to stand out or differentiate? Is it, for do you want to be more disruptive? Do you want to be more comforting? What is that aspect of your brand and your values that you want to be known for? And is it coming through with perception? So the thing with perception is there's a lot of base perceptions that you want within your industry, and then there's those added ones that you're like, hey, for differentiation, we really want to be known for X. Are we actually being known for it now or later? In terms of global and local, it's and I it's one of my favorite subjects just because I've kind of worked on both teams, is you want a positioning that is generally set globally, and you want it to have enough flexibility within it that it can be interpreted, and that's kind of where implementation comes in, that it can be interpreted correctly within your like region or locality. It should feel universal enough, is what I'm trying to say. Like when you look at, say, Etsy's positioning, it's make commerce human. And if you're in the US, you might interpret making commerce human executionally in different ways, but you kind of have that starting point. While maybe in China, this idea of making commerce human is something else. So it's making sure that whatever that positioning is works for the company and can be interpreted in different ways within different regions and localities. Does how does how does that sound from your experience, or have you seen kind of other points in terms of consumer perception or local versus global?
No, no, totally. It like whatever that you said, it totally makes sense. Because, for example, uh, I was working on this brand Tresemme, right? So Tresemme is global perception, and
Yeah.
when I'm working in India, so where just making like the shampoo industry is not like you don't have to be disruptive. Like people here mostly leans towards like the natural ingredients and how it can like help your hair and what has been passed down from your ancestors and like the rituals and everything, right?
Mm.
And Tresemme, like they're positioning something very professional styling, uh, which might not cater to a lot of audience, but how we have to transcend that to the umbrella perception, to the umbrella positioning. So that was like quite a task. So was trying to like know how you do that in the day-to-day like strat.
I think you bring up a good point, which is like perception is like
Yeah.
indeed kind of that global idea of perception and local idea of perception. And I've seen that as well within brands where, especially if a brand is really strong within strong identity within one region, it's a very American brand or it's a very, German brand. And then when you deal with that brand in other markets, I do think the local perception is the most important in terms of how do you make it even feel relevant? Because if you, I don't know, and probably seen this as well, as if you bring a brand in and it's just not speaking that the right language or kind of storyline, it just people won't. It will look like you just took a brand from another place and kind of plopped it in without that consideration. Um, so I do think those local perceptions are really important to say, hey, especially back to a global team, like we know you're doing professional, but the way that we need to interpret it is X. And we will keep aspects of the positioning in this way. I do think, and I've seen this on the global side, when someone can come with a local perception and say this is a stronger way to interpret that, or we're going to have to amplify this aspect of the brand. Um, it's usually the right way to go. And that's why I think with the positioning is it needs to have enough space where if you only focus on one aspect of it or kind of amplify that one, it can still work within different places and different regions. But the idea of global perception versus local perception is strong. And that's where I also think, which we didn't really touch on this, that when you're doing a positioning, especially with, some of the global brands you all have worked on, is it is important to get that feedback from regions. Because if we don't think about it, then strategists like yourself have to be like, oh no, we
Right.
can't talk about professional within, within our context. We have to talk about, something else. But
Yeah, because more often than not, like the data don't cross silos, right? Like it just stays there, and there's no communication, and there's just the gap that just kind of destroys it, the messaging, the proposition.
no, it's a great point is, and especially with the idea of implementation is indeed once it gets to certain like countries and regions, you you don't you want it to work, versus having to rethink it. So I'll definitely note that for another aspect to address. So thanks for that.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you.
But yeah, I've seen that where you have to like redo the positioning, and it's always a bit of a I wouldn't say problem, but it really can delay things, and you have to have quite a bit of conversations around it. Oh, Lucia, can you share an example of a brand that successfully repositioned itself and what it made it work? Also, okay, we'll start with that. And also, what metrics should brands use to evaluate the success of the positioning strategy? Actually, one, and this was a B2B company, or still is, in terms of your first question of a good repositioning, was Siemens. And they are a German company that does everything from like infrastructure to healthcare. They have just a very broad portfolio. The company is 175 years old. And they, in the last, I think it was last year, they repositioned their brand from being a tech leader, which what does that mean? To being about everyday transformation. And so that changeover in terms of a positioning really helped to expand not only how they talked about their business, but how they make what they do, which is very big projects, how to make that a little bit more human and understandable. And you can see that within their creative work, how that started to change it from, to be honest, generic techie things because of that initial positioning to something that felt like they could have a bit more ownership of what that creatively meant in terms of kind of everyday transformations. So that to me was successful because it took the issue of not just being grouped within tech, because that really doesn't talk about what Siemens can do, and to really differentiate who they are and what their significance or impact is. So that one really stood out to me, and I love talking about B2B because we overlook it, but that I think that was one nice example. And you could see, I think any successful positioning is when you see what problem they were solving, and you could see the problem they were solving was if we're just within tech and grouped within that, you get all these generic ideas what tech looks like, and you can't really stand out or even just be more authentic to what you are as a company. So I thought that was a good example in terms of a
Oh, thank you so much for the example. I was actually having a coffee yesterday with a friend that works for Siemens, so
Oh my
I
gosh,
will bring it up next time.
that's so cool. I wrote about them if it helps with your coffee. I did that case study in a couple months ago in my LinkedIn newsletter because I was just so enthralled with how they did that. But cool that you're discussing with them. So that's a really strange overlap, but they're an amazing company, especially when it comes to like their growth, their age, and their portfolio. Like we're enamored by companies of 10 years and they're like 175 years old. So they've transformed a couple times. Um, we have 2 minutes. Metrics. What metrics should a brand use to evaluate success of their positioning strategy? I would say it's best to choose kind of 3 to 5 metrics, not too many, not too little. Have a key, like the metric, if you will, like really what our issue is. And it does depend on what do you want that brand positioning to do in terms of what metric you would choose and what do you want to do for the brand, and also how to make sure that that metric overlaps with the business. So it's going to be different. To be honest, it'll be kind of different things, but some of the common ones are, brand perception, which will be kind of both qualitative and quantitative. The other one will be kind of customer lifetime value in terms of if someone really believes in where your brand was and how it starts to keep growing. And then it's also making sure that you can see as people are using products, if they are still kind of your overall retention. So not only lifetime value, but like how you're retaining customers and clients. So those are some examples, but it really is choosing ones that are going to address what your business problem is and then what your kind of brand problem is. But perception and also awareness are 2 really common ones that you'll see within brands. Well, thank you all. Oh, hey, Shannon. Love the flower. I know it's a little ridiculous. It clarifies aspects. Which would you prioritize if resources are limited? And oh no, Jaguar. If resources, I do not know why that just became like a thing. If resources are limited, I would say it really starts with, to be honest, team training, like to make sure people understand the positioning because they will uh, expand on that later. And the other one would be sales and marketing because they're going to be the ones who will first start to put that message into the market once all the teams really start to understand it. And that can kind of go before innovation work, if you will. So I almost see that as like the first front line, if that's an okay comparison. And then innovation is something that'll keep growing afterwards. So I think internal team training of some sort is always priority. And then it's like making sure that we can get people who are talking about our brands with people now to really understand and then try it out as well. And they can also even give some feedback. Jaguar, for me, it's I actually kind of agreed with one of my directors, which is I think as creatives, we should be supporting our industries. And we're supposed to be saying like challenging the status quo. And then when someone else challenges it, we get angry at, or we kind of feel really negative. I and also I don't really know what their business strategy was. So I'm on the camp of I wish it was a more diverse conversation in terms of not just liking or disliking it, and also supporting the idea that we as creatives, strategists, designers want to, actually challenge the status quo and maybe it works or doesn't, but we don't want to be kind of shot down all the time. So that was my feeling and kind of the vibe. That's why I didn't actually talk about it that much because I'm actually still wanting to see what happens, to be honest. Like you launch something and people say stuff, but we don't know how it's going to play out. I'm very much it helps to wait to see how things play out because you never know what side of the brand or brand history you'll be on. So that was kind of my perspective on Jaguar. I haven't seen a conversation like that for quite a long time around a rebrand. Actually, I've seen little like, oh, we didn't like flat circles or something from MasterCard, but I haven't seen people get so. I actually want to understand why people got it was such a big conversation. That's really what was in my mind. It was just why are people reacting this way, in terms of just whether it's timing or context. Good question. It's it's an interesting one. Well, thank you all. I realize we are 2 minutes over, and I'm so glad you all joined this initial webinar, and your kind of feedback and questions were awesome. So thank you all. It's great to see you.